Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we revisit that piece of news that came out during Summer League from Doc Rivers. Khris Middleton with dual ankle surgery in the offseason. How big of a deal is this for the Bucks? What's plan B? And who would be most important in his absence? We get into all of that coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever it is you get your podcasts. You can view us on YouTube as well. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. One of the polarizing shows, Camille, anytime we mention the name of Khris Middleton, but especially when you lump that in with injuries and surgery, it seems like it brings out even more of the bloodlust as we've discovered through the years. I don't think there are many Bucks fans that are somewhere in the middle. You either love Khris Middleton, you think, man, he's great, and I don't think the other half of Bucks fans appreciate everything he does, or you're in the other camp that maybe you didn't think he was good to begin with, because we heard quite a bit of that in the summer of 2019, or it's just the complaints about the injuries. But probably the most polarizing player the Bucks have on the team. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, outside of somebody like who more recently became polarizing, like a Pat Connaughton because of his contract, or discussions around Brook Lopez and his usage, but consistently, Khris Middleton has been a very polarizing figure for Milwaukee Bucks fans. As you mentioned, even when he got that contract back in was 19, where it was like, is he really worth all this money? And then, of course, all of the conversation that came out when Drew was traded in order to bring in Damian Lillard, there was a subset of people saying, why didn't they trade Khris Middleton? Which, for the record, again, wasn't possible because he had just signed a contract. So for the Bucks to do that Dame trade, the only movable salary was Drew. So yeah, I think it's very, very fair to say that Khris Middleton is like the most polarizing Milwaukee Buck on this team. And he has been for some years now.
So it brings us to present day. And I think maybe you started to shift over. To be clear, let's just get this out there. I think, all the everydayers are obviously aware of this, but you and I are on that team that says, hey, this guy's really good. And I think even Bucks fans have slept on some of the things that he's done. But then we learned the surgery. And this was an interesting offseason where you looked at what he did in the playoffs last spring and you thought, okay, as you and I discussed several times, it works, right? You see the vision that if Giannis was there, if Dame was healthy, you saw what Khris Middleton gave you in those spots. Like, okay, you got three guys you feel pretty good about. How do you fill in the gaps with the defense and everything else? So I think there was that sense of optimism coming into the season. Maybe it was just hope, but the other things we talked about with the continuity and year number 1.5 for Doc and the staff, training camp for all the young guys. But I would be lying if I said a little bit of wind wasn't taken out of the sails when we learned, hey, Khris had surgery on both ankles this summer. He's going to be fine for training camp. I'm not opting to be a pessimist here, but I would just say we had heard that before with Khris, with Pat Connaughton, and a few others.
Yeah, I think it's disingenuous to say, even as the biggest Khris Middleton fan, like to hear the news that he had double ankle surgery in the offseason isn't at least somewhat concerning of like, oh, at least a little red flag of like, okay, something to keep an eye on. Because when he turned that left ankle in that game against the Phoenix Suns, when he was shooting the three, Kevin Durant's foot ended up underneath Chris's. He turned his ankle really bad. The recovery period for that was a lot longer than what we expected for Khris. And as it was going on, Khris came out himself and was like, I have never had an ankle sprain this bad before. It was 16 games, if I remember correctly, that he missed with that particular injury. And we saw in the playoffs, the other ankle got injured along the way as well. So we knew, like, we make jokes like in the playoffs, like he's out here playing with two bad ankles. Like he is really just giving everything that he has. So in one sense, it makes sense to me to say like, okay, these were very like, especially the left ankle that took so long to recover, where it's like they just need to clean up a little bit of what's going on in there to make sure it continues to heal properly. But again, I think it's fair to say, like, if you hear that he had 2 surgeries, to just have some kind of concern about that, because no matter if it's minor or major, you never want to hear about surgery having to be done to a player.
So I guess we'll just fast forward to the big question, the $1 million question, big deal or not. Scale of 1 to 10, where would you put this in terms of, is this a big deal that Khris had surgery on both ankles? I'll say a 6, just because it's both. As we mentioned, we'd seen, and it's not a knock on Khris or any of the individual players.
Right.
You never know how rehab is going to go or the severity of injuries. We've seen this kind of drag with some other players. Khris, one of them. So I don't think it's the worst case scenario, but I also don't think it's anything that you can just dismiss. So I got to put it a little bit above the middle of the road. So I'm going to say a 6 on a scale of 1 to 10, whether or not this is a big deal.
Yeah, I'm a little bit lower than you, but not by too much. I'm like a 4.5, 5, somewhere in there, where it's in that middle of a road of like, it gets my attention. For sure, it gets my attention. It's something to keep an eye on. But all the reports that came out were saying that, he's expected to be good by training camp. Reports from Summer League, like he's moving around perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Like if I didn't know that he had surgery or was told, wouldn't have been able to tell. Right, from just how he was moving around. So, like, again, there is some concern of like, okay, didn't expect this, especially coming off of an off or a playoff run where it's like, again, y'all, what more does he have to prove to y'all to show his value? So, like, there is some concern for me. But hearing it was a cleanup for the most part, assuming that we don't hear any other news about him not being able to play for training camp or things are delayed, I think I'm going to stay around that 4.5, 5 mark.
The reaction when you heard that was almost like the scene in The Office where Michael Scott says to Jen, "You cheated on me when I specifically asked you not to." Like, you had surgery when we specifically asked you just stay healthy and have some rehab in the off season. So that's kind of what it felt like when you learned. But again, yeah, it's not a 10. It's not anything there. To me, even being above the 5 is just because, as we mentioned, it's, it's tough to really put into words and try to say, okay, what is it in terms of, is Khris Middleton injury prone? Because, it started basically when he slipped on a wet spot. Prior to that, he was very healthy and durable throughout his career. And then it was just kind of one thing after another. So on the one hand, I have a hard time saying he's injury prone when that's what got a lot of this started in terms of the heavy time that he missed. But, if we're going by the numbers, you can't point to the games played and not say, maybe he's injury prone with those games missed. So to me, the other reason why I put it at a 6 and above that midpoint on the scale is really because of what it would mean for the rest of the group. So I do want to get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you now about our friends over at Game Time. It's summertime. It's time to take in all of those summer concerts, or maybe you're a sports fan outside of basketball. You want to check off some major league stadiums on your road trip. That's where Game Time comes in to give you that assist, coming in as that closer out of the bullpen for the save, if you will. It is the best ticketing source to use when you're on the road or even in your home city looking for tickets to that event. They offer last-minute deals where you save up to 60% off on last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. Flash deals as well, where you save with exclusive in-app deals on select games ahead of that game time or event. The two things I like best about a Game Time here, the all-in pricing. Just toggle on that feature. You see exactly what it is you're paying when you get to the checkout screen with no sticker shock, and see the view from your seat as well, a panoramic view of what you're going to see with those exact tickets. Extra helpful if you're at a ballpark or event you haven't been to in the past. And of course, this comes with the lowest price guarantee. If you can find those seats cheaper, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. And again, create an account and use that code LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA, to get $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. So I mentioned it brings in the rest of this. So to me, Camille, it is, look, even getting that messaging, if we expect them to be ready to go by training camp, I shouldn't say we have no reason to not believe that, because as we've seen a couple of times where it hasn't been the case, but let's assume that's the case. I don't know about you. I still don't feel like, even if Khris is healthy, and look, we'll get to both sides of the argument that we've heard from a couple of listeners and fans, but even if Khris is healthy, I'm just not quite sure what to expect in terms of games played in this upcoming season. If what we saw last year continues, where he doesn't play in one part of the back-to-back, maybe you work in even more rest time as well. That's why I kind of elevated it to, okay, if he does miss time, and then we have to rely on somebody, even though we just talked about, look, they have upgraded their roster. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You still want to upgrade the Khris Middleton spot. You upgraded pieces that you knew you had leaving, and how do we make it better? There's no real plan B for Khris replacement protection, right? I mean, that's where it's basically, well, we still have Giannis and Dame.
Absolutely. Like, this team, we can't say this enough or emphasize this enough. It's the fact that this team is built around Giannis, Dame, and Khris. Like, those three healthy is the core of the team for the most part. Like, of course, you have Brook Lopez, who's a big contributor as well. You have Bobby off the bench, so on and so forth. But like, this team goes as those top three guys goes. And with those top three guys, as you mentioned, with the roster around them, I do think that this roster is better this year than it was last year heading into the season. But it's about the pieces around them. Like, we're not saying like, okay, if one of these big three is hurt, like, the Bucks are still going to roll. Like, yeah, you would hope they can sustain an injury to one of the other big three for a moment until the other guy can come back, because now you have, three options. But if Khris isn't there, he's a big piece of what they do. And we've mentioned before, it's not only the scoring and the fact that he can create his own shot, but it's also the playmaking and how he's able to set up his teammates. He's able to take pressure off of other guys, which is really, really important. So yeah, if he's not healthy, like, all of this, like, championship aspirate, like, that comes farther away. Like, it feels like it's further away if he's hurt. So I definitely get that piece of it. And there is no true Khris Middleton replacement. All that you could do in that situation is try to, you're going to lean more on Dame and Giannis if that is the case. And then you're going to see off the bench, like, hey, can Prince come in and soak up some of these small forward minutes? And he's already playing. We've seen Lakers fans saying you don't want him playing 25, 30 minutes a night. But it also would open the door for one of those young guys as well to get a little bit more playing time, because now with how the roster shakes out, with your five starters, with Gary Trent Jr. being the starting shooting guard off the bench, you're looking at Bobby Portis, Taurean Prince, DeLon Wright. It's 8 guys right there. We haven't even mentioned Pat Connaughton. Then you have the young guys with AJ Green, with Andre Jackson Jr., with Chris Livingston, with Marjan. So it's like some of those guys would have to get more playing time. And honestly, I don't think it's the worst idea during the regular season to continue giving Khris the second night off of back-to-backs. I wouldn't be mad if Dame or Giannis also gets that treatment from time throughout the season, and then just lean on those younger guys a little bit more in the regular season to soak up some of those minutes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the tough part. I'm there with you, but as a few people pointed out, and it's a fair pushback, resting them during the regular season doesn't guarantee they're going to be healthy once you get to April, or it doesn't guarantee you're going to be able to avoid an injury in game 2 in the playoffs, as we've seen with Giannis throughout the course of the last couple. Granted, it was right before the playoffs last year, but it doesn't really guarantee anything to me. It's more of just, I get that. I would much rather be much more cautious with Khris during the regular season, knowing as the roster is currently constructed, if you don't have a healthy Khris Middleton, I don't think you can win a championship. You can't contend with those other teams. That's the importance that he brings. Like, yes, you have Giannis and Dame, but you need that additional help. Dame is the half-court scorer. Giannis, not so much. You need someone else, as we saw when the Bucks won the championship. You need somebody else that can step up in those moments, and that is Khris Middleton. So I don't think they can reach their ceiling without a healthy Khris, regardless of what a handful of Bucks fans may or may not think. So he's the one exception that I would say, look, I get that with Giannis and Dame. I mean, I'm all for preserving some of Giannis's minutes, but I also feel like you can't just play in fear where it's, well, we can only play him every 3 games or something like that. But with Khris, I think it's a little different because he is the supplemental piece. And, it's like when you're a baseball team that stinks, but you have a really good pinch hitter. Like, great. When is he going to get used? In that one game during a homestand where it's relatively close? It's kind of the same argument with Khris of, if you don't have Khris with healthy Giannis and Dame, obviously it's a better spot to be in than just, hey, Khris, go get them alone. But, if you don't have the rest around him and it's just him, it doesn't matter anyway. So that's where I kind of fall with, I'm perfectly fine with them coming into this season and saying, as somebody pointed out in the comments, over under for Khris, 40 games played realistically. I mean, I'm not that dire about it, but played 55 games last year. He played 33 games the year prior to that. That was the lengthy rehab and the start and stop. Missed 16 games the year after they won a championship. And keep in mind, that was when it was the start stops, the strange 2-year stretch where the bubble came into play. The next season got pushed back. Bucks played until July, late July. And then Khris goes and plays in the Olympics, and he missed 16 games coming off of that. It was, towards the end of the season when that injury occurred in the playoffs. Year prior to that, he missed 4 games when they won a championship. He missed 11 games the season prior to that. He missed 5 games prior to that. So this really boils down to that game against the Bulls when you just go through his health. He had that hamstring injury years and years ago, but it really started with that injury of slipping on the wet spot. And that's the tough thing to grapple with I don't know that you can call that injury prone, but when you look at the numbers, I mean, you also have to call it what it is. Yeah, he misses a lot of time recently.
He does. And with that, it's like you said, just because you sit during the regular season, it's no guarantee that you're going to be ready to play come playoff time, because anything can happen. It's the same argument that I normally use. People are like, oh, I don't like my favorite player playing international basketball. And it's like, well, they're going to be hooping over the summer as it is. So injuries can happen at any time. Like you can't play in fear, like you said, but you're looking at Khris Middleton and just the injury history, a medical team that has been working with him for years at this point. So I'm going to trust whatever the plan is around how he plays. I think how they did it last year again was smart for him. Like you're not going to play a back-to-back in the playoffs. I could care less if he's playing the second night or the first time back-to-back. Like
you're not going to play 3 games in 5 days in the playoffs.
Exactly. So and he's getting older as well. I mean, this roster is getting older, the main guys here. So as the comment here from Winning Gambler on YouTube says, old NBA bodies take even longer to heal. Even when you have somebody like a LeBron James, who we've seen historically throughout his career be injury free, but as he's gotten older, we've seen ankles keep him out for a little bit longer, so on and so forth. So I'm all about trying to find ways during the regular season, because it is a long journey. 82 games is a lot of basketball to play before you get to the playoffs. So I'm also here for trying just to find ways to keep minutes a little bit lower. It doesn't have to be drastic. Just take a couple minutes off every single night if you can, looking at just what he averaged last year, where you're like, okay, he comes in the game, he played 27 minutes a game. That's cool. That's around there for the regular season, sure. And then as the playoffs start approaching, if you can try to ramp that up so the conditioning is right for him to play more in the playoffs, then go for it. But again, just because you do that, it's no guarantee it's going to work out. I mean, look at Kawhi and what they've been doing with him for the past few years with the Clippers, where it's like you think that they got it managed right, and then come playoff time, it's just not right. So again, winning a championship takes some luck, and part of that luck happens to be the health of your main guys.
And I mean, that's, when you point to the minutes, and we'll get into who's behind him coming up in the next segment, but that's the last thing I want to touch on here is when you point to the minutes. Yeah, I mean, 27, and as someone pointed out in the comments too, he was on a minutes restriction for a decent amount of those games. The year prior, when it was kind of the same, rehabbing from an injury and working him back in the mix, it was only about 24, 25 minutes a game that he played in. But when you got to the playoffs, each of those 2 seasons, it was 35 minutes a game 2 years ago, played 38 minutes a game against the Indiana Pacers when he was all they had for 40, 50% of that series. So that's kind of what you're pointing to with Khris specifically. I don't think it really applies to Giannis and Dame. And I suppose Brook is another one that you would throw into that mix of these are the guys because of what we're asking for from you. You're the supplemental piece. It does us no good if you go out, before the playoffs. So we can kind of put you on ice a little bit in the hopes that it's 35 or so minutes that you're getting from Khris in the postseason. Then who knows with Brook? It may be matchup dependent. But to me, those are the 2 guys I would look at and say if they miss time, Brook to a different extent there. If they miss time, they miss time, and we'll figure out the pieces around it. We just need to be feeling like we're in a good spot moving into the postseason with their health, Khris specifically. So if he does miss time, and again, the messaging is he's going to be ready to go for training camp. But what if that's not the case? And even with what we just said, if we anticipate him to play in 50, 55 games this upcoming season, maybe it's a minutes restriction, somebody's going to have to pick up that slack. So who is the most likely person on the current roster to fill that spot? We'll get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks. All right, Camille. We went through high level, the basically depth chart and rotations for the Bucks this upcoming season. We didn't get into the minutes just yet. I mean, we'll save that for a little bit later in the offseason when you get into, okay, this player could play X amount of minutes and so on. But we've gone through who's on the roster for the team. Right. So broadly speaking, if Khris Middleton is not ready for the start, let's just use this as one scenario. He's not ready for the start of training camp. He misses the first 2 weeks of the regular season, let's say. Who starts at small forward?
I would assume it's Prince. And I would hope that if that is the case, that the rotation in that 3 spot is just a little bit bigger. So meaning you're not going to be out here playing Prince 35 minutes, 30 minutes or something like that, even if he is the starting 3. In addition to that, what you would do is that you would just up the minutes of some of these younger guys on the bench who might not get as much playing time, but during this stretch of time, you would see them on the court more. So Andre Jackson, maybe instead of him playing, 7 to 8 minutes a night, it's 15. And then you kind of just stretch that out a little bit more. Maybe you throw AJ Green in there a little bit, just soak up some of those wing minutes as well. And then also, I don't know if they would go as far as trying to go really small and doing some type of lineup where you have Dame out there, and then you can go with Wright as well with the AJ Green at that 2 spot. You kind of move right up a little. I don't know exactly how you could do that, but I think that the idea would be Prince would probably start. And then from there, I would just want to see more minutes from some of the guys who might not get as many. So another 5, 6 minutes on top of what guys are normally getting.
I want to follow up on that in a second, but one of the comments that we had of the idea that Khris can just play 40 to 45 games, then show up in the playoffs and we win the title is a fantasy. I mean, look, we just went through what Khris did last year, where it was 55 games, so 10 more than that threshold that you're pointing to. But the minutes played and the version of Khris Middleton that you got would back that up of, yes, he can play reduced minutes in games in the regular season and be that guy when a defense, maybe it wasn't the best defense in the world, but that defense was fully locked in on Khris Middleton. This is the only option the Bucks have, and he did that. So I don't think it's a fantasy per se. But look, I get it's not that easy. There's a lot of variables that go into it. I agree with you that Taurean Prince is the likely starter, not just the scenario we used was if Khris misses some time to start the season in any game that Khris Middleton misses. I would assume Taurean Prince gets the start. I do wonder, though, because we're going to be inclined to point to, well, I mean, look, it may be last chance, now or never time for MarJon. If that's the case, that there's going to be minutes opened up of what Taurean Prince would have theoretically played as the backup. Somebody has to take those minutes on now. I think the inclination would definitely be, well, MarJon, that fits his position. You mentioned Pat Connaughton. that may go over like a lead balloon with some Bucks fans, but that's another very, very, at least easy plug and play option that you have there. The one that I wonder about the most, especially if it is early in the season, is if you have this stretch where you're not going to have Khris for 2 weeks to start the season, something like that. We have not talked about this player quite as much, probably because we did not see them in Summer League because of an ankle injury, ironically enough. Does that open the door for who the Bucks just signed to a 2-way deal early in the offseason, Stanley Umude?
I don't think
Not to be like a huge piece of the rotation, but like we need somebody to take backup minutes for 10 minutes a night. Let's see what you can do every handful of games.
I would think that it might actually go to your guy, Khris Livingston, more than anything. Like just thinking, and we still have training camp to get through. So like how they're perceived is going to continue to go up and down here. But I think Khris Livingston showed in Summer League a bit like you can just kind of plug him in. He can do all the garbage work. He's not somebody who's going to need a lot of touches, so on and so forth. He's the big body. He can go defend. He can play up a little bit, play down. So theoretically. So like that's a guy who I would point to before I get to Stanley Umude, where it's like, I think that Livingston could kind of soak up some of those minutes there. And the Marjan piece of it, it's like, I will be very curious to see where he comes in, just like on the depth chart for some of these other guys. Because again, AJ Green, Andre Jackson, Khris Livingston. And I would think at this moment that Marjan's probably a little bit behind all three of those guys. So I think they would lean on that first before they hit the two-way guys up. But you never know how it might go during the season because, again, it's a long regular season. There's a lot of minutes to soak up.
And again, to be clear, I'm not saying you misunderstood me, but just so it's not viewed as he says that Stanley Umude can step in and start and play X amount of minutes. I'm talking about, does this open the door for Stanley Umude to basically take what Marjan did last year? And that, all right, for this stretch, you're going to play 7 minutes. You're going to play 8 minutes. And we're just going to see what you can do at that spot. Because, Frank and I talked about it too on the mailbags and I think one other episode. I mean, low key under the radar. Oh yeah, the Bucks have an option here in a decision to make on Marjan and picking up that final. What do you do with that final year of his contract? And we'll learn that early in the season. So that may also tell us who's going to earn those minutes. Again, not just if Khris misses time to start the season, but just any of those games that Khris Middleton is going to miss. And he's going to miss some. He's not going to play 82 games. None of these guys probably are. But that's going to be another big tell that we get is what happens with the contract for Marjan Beauchamp. We keep inching closer and closer to learning the schedule for the Bucks. We're already almost into August, and as we talked about the other day, that always starts to come out relatively soon here. We're also going to get into some discussion on a little bit of what we kind of touched on here, but what players have the most to prove, whose season is this biggest for, or who has the biggest season in front of us on the Bucks roster. We'll get into that. I mentioned the minutes. How do you project those things? We'll get into that conversation as we feel like the offseason is basically wound down now. And pretty soon we'll know where you can watch all of the games as well as we await that decision. But leave your thoughts on Khris Middleton. I have a feeling I know based on the chats what they are, but leave your thoughts on Khris Middleton and whether or not this injury or these surgeries are a big deal for the Bucks this upcoming season. Leave those in the chats. That'll do it for today's show. We'll be back once again tomorrow with more Locked On Bucks.